the Super Bowl. It's become so ingrained in American popular culture that it's difficult to imagine a time before all the hype surrounding the big game existed. That's not to suggest that the professional football's popularity or the concept of a championship game for the sport was invented in 1967 with Super Bowl I, which, by the way, was a title given retroactively. American football had consistently gained a following throughout the 20th century and held several championship matches in that time. Instead, the arrival of the game between the seasoned National Football League and the upstart American Football League is significant because of when it happened, and as such, it is a perfect document of the time period. Deremy is the co-host of the Bigger Than the Game podcast, a show which looks at sports through the lens of history. I couldn't have asked for a better partner to discuss and dissect the 1967 World Championship game between the NFL's Green Bay Packers and the AFL's Kansas City Chiefs.
Welcome back to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm Eric Paul. And I'm joined today by Deremy from the Bigger Than the Game podcast, which we cross paths through Instagram, as it always seems to happen with the show, which I'm delighted about. And because both of us have a history-centric podcast, and because mine is called Everything, it was a match made in heaven. It was perfect because yours is all about sports and sports history, and I love how your podcast covers such a number of different eras. How did you get into podcasting?
Well, first, Eric, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on, and big fan of your podcast also.
Thank you.
We kind of got into it. My partner Jose and I, we were working together at our previous job, and he was at that point the only person at the job who was a big sports fan like me. But then sometimes he would be sitting by my office and I would peek out and he's on YouTube watching old school highlights, old school games, and I was like, hey, you watch that? And he was like, oh, he kind of had that look like, yeah, I like the old school. And I go, nah, me too, man. And we started talking and we were just going, and I was doing a previous podcast at the time, and I told him like, hey, you should come on, or we should think about doing one. And so Jose, after a while, he said, I'm interested, I want to do that. And about January of 2020, we said, let's do it. And we're going to do a sports history podcast. We and it's a little bit of pop culture too, but mostly sports history. And we did about 7 before the world shut down and everything kind of, we had to do it over the phone for the next 13 months. But, later on this month, we'll be hitting our 3-year anniversary, and we've had over 125 episodes and counting, and it's been amazing.
It is such a fun medium. I always like to spend, especially, and I've always found that the best guests on my program are fellow podcasters. And I guess I'm like the next, I'm the junior podcaster in this situation because I've only been doing it since November of 21. So like I'm taking cues from those of you who, it's like a badge of honor being like, yeah, we started before everybody else did, before COVID-19, right. We were actually doing this. And, that's, I think, something to, you should declare more often, just to let people know. They're like, listen, I was on that, first wave of podcasting, before everybody else started doing it. But I think that this is only, I think, the second or third time I've tackled, no pun intended, Super Bowl I, but a sport or a sporting event as a primary source. But sports are, especially professional spectator sports, they're just wonderful examples of pop culture because, and that really seems when we get into talking about the first Super Bowl, it's really where it kind of came from, is that football, professional football, NFL football, and AFL football were gaining so much popularity in the 60s that it was almost like they had to do what they ultimately did with the World Championship game. But I'm with you both. I love ESPN Classic. Like if I'm flipping the channels and I come across, like I could watch like a Major League playoff game from 1993, just like, oh yeah, okay, I'll watch this, because not only do I remember it, I have like a recollection of watching it the first time, but what's always astounding to me is how, first of all, I don't know if you're like me, I always think of like the 90s weren't that long ago, but then they were like 30 years ago.
Same.
Like,
Same.
oh crap, like, oh my God, look how much time's gone by. But you don't really recognize the evolution of the different sports until you look at a game from them. When you watch
Correct.
those old reruns, you're like, oh man, like even their batting stances in baseball, their equipment, the pads in football were like remarkably different in the 90s than they are now.
Right. And it's interesting because you made a great point I feel like always, and that's how I was, and to understand where the game is now, present day, and where the game's going, you need to know where it came from, how it got there, and that evolution. And I'm the same, before the pie, that's what I did on YouTube all the time, like just always watching old games, old sports documentaries. And it's just awesome because it's what you said about how the game has changed and how the television coverage is different, but it's also a lot of times history, the narrative can change. And sometimes like, and today in 2023, about an event in sports in the 90s, we're saying, this is how it always was. This is how, we always viewed this player, this team. But then when you're watching that live, game footage, you're kind of getting something different. Like, this guy wasn't covered that way, or this team wasn't praised like that, and it's good to see. Like, it's interesting how the narrative can change in a lot of different ways if you don't take that time to look back and being like, no, it always wasn't talked about this way.
Right. And even like the introduction, like in football, the introduction of instant replay, it wasn't always there. Or even it's like, I sometimes have that, like I'm like, I remember a time before the 2-point conversion was brought from college to NFL football, like, or brought back, I guess. You're right, it changes so much perspective about what you're looking at, like, because as we're recording this, and I'm going to be putting this episode out right before the Super Bowl, but the playoffs just started this weekend with the wild card round, and we had that situation that took place with the Bills and the Bengals not being able to play their game, and people are going back and forth talking about, this is historic, it's unprecedented, where you have two teams that didn't get to finish their season, and what does that mean for if they both make it next, further down the line, or either one of them does. And somebody pointed out online, they're like, well, that NFL is like entertainment first. It's not necessarily, and even with, like, if you go back far enough in history, so much of the like championships and stuff were not really about hard and fast rules. A lot of it was entertainment. They're like, what's to give our audience the best experience? We don't really aren't too much careful about, like, because I think so many of us have it in our head that the rule books were like written around the same time as the Constitution, that, like, they've always been there,
right?
Just, but the rules change just like the game does, for the times, like,
no, you're right. And I think that's why, when we talk, on Instagram, and this topic is so important, there's like the obvious reasons, like, it's the first Super Bowl, but the other reasons are, like you said, like this is kind of really getting to that culmination of when football overtook baseball as America's top sport.
Yeah.
And really becoming, from this like moment on, really, it's becoming so a part of American culture, and is one of the first things you think about when you think of America and society is like football. And there's so many different reasons for that. And a big one is kind of what we're talking about, like the television deals and football becoming so popular, and the way that it's being covered on TV in the 60s was a big reason why we kind of saw football overtake baseball as America's number one sport.
So I think that's a wonderful place to start with the breakdown of it, because the first question I always offer up for when dealing with a primary source, when looking at something as a document of its time, is what materials it made from and or how is it made. And when it comes to the first Super Bowl, or as it was called when it was played, the World Championship, because they had dubbed, I think it was like the second or third one that they finally got it. They called it Super Bowl.
Super Bowl 3.
Yeah, and then they're like, retroactively, we'll call this one Super Bowl 1 just for our own help. It is a time where, like, for a long time, football and baseball were they were closer to each other than nowadays we recognize. And I can't think of any, like, for example, I can't think of any of the modern football fields that still use, the baseball and football share the field. Like, I always got a kick out of that watching like a Raiders game or something when they were in Oakland, and they'd be like tackling a guy by second base, like there's the pitcher's mound's still there, but it's on the 20-yard line. And like, you don't see that as much anymore. But in the 60s, you absolutely did see it a lot, because a lot of markets had both baseball and football, and they would use the same facilities, for both sports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm from Philadelphia, so Philly Veterans Stadium had both the Eagles and Phillies. Pittsburgh with Three Rivers had the Pirates and the Steelers, and I'm not sure if Cincinnati with their stadium, they might have had the Reds and the Bengals back then too.
I can kind of picture it. I think,
like,
the AstroTurf field with the four, dirt spots.
So, you're absolutely right. There was that combination, and getting ready for this show, there was polls that in 1961, the beginning of the decade, all these Gallup polls showed baseball, 34% to football, pro football at 21% in popularity. You fast forward, by the time the decade is over, that has switched, and football has overtaken baseball as the top sport. And even for a while, college football was more popular than pro football.
Yeah.
So by the time the end of the 60s comes, football has jumped to the top spot.
Why do you think that is? Or another way of saying it, like, what does that tell you about American society in the 60s? Because I feel like that's not the only place that you see a big transition from, the early 60s being a carryover of the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you get to, but then things shift dramatically, like music changed dramatically from early to late. Movies and television changed a lot from early to late. What do you think that says about American society at the time, that baseball was overwhelmed by football?
I think there's it's a good amount of factors, but I think you're right. Like the 50s, like a lot of times when a decade begins, by the calendar, it's a new decade, but as far as society, it's still that previous decade. Right. In television, it was kind of emerging in the 50s, but in the 60s, it really kind of was taking off. Mm. And I feel like Pete Rozelle, as commissioner of the NFL, was really ahead of his time in understanding that. And even with the AFL, those owners and Al Davis and all, when he became commissioner, they understood the power of TV and the power that how football, can present itself on television. Because you have these CBS with NFL had a really good deal. The AFL struck a great television deal with NBC and had the revenue sharing. 62 was when NFL Films began, Ed and Steve Sable, and how huge that was for making the game more popular. I think those guys really understood television is the way of the future. We need to get on it. And I think that is one of the many reasons, but a big one, of why football overtook baseball in the 60s.
And, that TV culture, and I would also, look into that as well, as far as like football presents, I like, the use of that word there, presents itself a lot, I think, easier to follow on television than baseball does. Mm-hmm. I mean, it took me as a kid a long time to understand the perspective, because most of the time a baseball game, for a good part of it, is filmed from behind the pitcher, from center field behind the pitcher, and it's like, you don't really get the sense of like space with that, because it's like, okay, so are they next to each other? Like it as a kid, I used to get, and the only time that really happened to me watching football was during extra point attempts, or field goals. And like, I didn't really understand where they were on the field, but most of the game you have that nice, gridiron setup with all the different, markers. It goes left to right. You can find where the action is pretty easily by, wherever you see, football is a much larger ball than baseball is.
Right.
It's not going to get lost in, they're not kicking it all the time, so it gets lost in the sky. I find myself, like, if I'm watching a baseball game, I like watching baseball on TV, fine, but it's kind of hard to get into if you are like jumping in the fourth inning or something. Whereas football, you can just show up at any time and kind of catch on to what's going on pretty quick. You don't need to have, a huge explanation. So I wonder if that's why, you have that television culture that was really underway in the 60s that, football kind of worked a little bit better on TV than baseball.
Yeah. And a lot of people will say it. I'm obviously, I do podcasting, so I love to listen. So I listen to all sports growing up and now on the radio. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people will say baseball plays better on the radio than football. But for TV, football is better than baseball. And I think that's true, but I think baseball also, and we see even today, is still kind of struggling and finally starting to adapt its ways, more. Baseball was kind of stubborn, where I think football, it just had that effect of that dramatic feel. Yeah. It had that militaristic kind of like, there's a battle, like, can, the offense move against the defense. NFL Films was taking it inside the huddle, and you're getting to know these players, and they're putting them, from in the 60s, Butkus, Lombardi, these guys became these great figures, they became this like mythological kind of thing, which baseball had before with, Ted Williams, DiMaggio, but that was in the radio time. It's different now when you get to see like NFL Films does a special on Lombardi, and it's a 60-minute like documentary on Vince Lombardi, and he's already this icon, but now he gets to be made to look like, George Patton. Right. He's this leader of men. It's just a different kind of thing that I feel like football was just ahead. You got to give it to Pete Rozelle, the TV networks, and it was just that perfect timing of how to present this game and how to popularize it and hook, America.
Yeah, it really does match up with the changing interests, I suppose, of the time period, and especially with the way that football. I always think of the George Carlin routine, football versus baseball, or baseball versus football, and he says a lot of the same things. It's like baseball is 19th century. It's agrarian. It's rural, whereas football is modern, and you see that with the two halls of fame. The Baseball Hall of Fame is in a pretty rural area. I mean, in Cooperstown, New York, it's right near the Farmers Museum is another part of it. So it's like, it's very rural. It's intentionally rural. The actual Hall of Fame itself has much more of like a, it's like a Greco-Roman type, with the marble and everything. And whereas the Football Hall of Fame, it's in Canton, Ohio, very, kind of like working class, pretty, Midwestern city. And it's like, the busts of all the guys, instead of just, the plaques, you get these nice, busts of them, but these look like they're floating on like lasers or something, the way they're, levitating around the room. And it has that much more of like, fully developed, industrial style, like high tech almost feel to it. Where baseball, like I was watching a baseball game this summer. Actually, it was the Phillies, and they had like Bryce Harper mic'd up, and they kept like in between, like while somebody was at bat, they were trying to interview him from the booth, and I'm like, what are you guys doing? This isn't baseball on TV. You're not like, just let him do his dugout thing. That's more of a football type move. Like when I watch a football game, I'm okay with, the sideline report, or the, baseball doesn't really, it doesn't work that way.
And I think that's the thing. I know we're the episodes for Super Bowl one and in that era. But if you look, not just in the '60s, but continuing, 1970 was the first year of Monday Night Football. Football, going to prime time and putting these players on the stage. Baseball, at that point, the World Series is still played in the afternoon. Like, its biggest showcase. There's no night games. Like, football throughout has always continued, not just to like ride the wave, but to lead that charge with all sports, not just baseball, as going further. And how do we showcase it? How do we present this sport to the masses? And that's why it's up there, for America, apple pie, football. Like, they own for a day. Sunday is church and football, that in this society. Like, it's just amazing how ingrained it is, and how just like you sometimes you think, oh, is this going to knock it down? Is this going to knock and the ratings may go down, but it's still king. It's still, I think it's what's keeping some of these networks and cable networks going is to get live sports, but especially to get the NFL is huge.
It is, and it really does match the way that the '60s was turning into such a fast-paced, instant gratification society. It wasn't about I'll watch a game for 4 hours. Baseball might go on for 11 innings, 12 innings. You never know. Whereas football is like, to go back to the Carlin routine, they have sudden death, if it
right
overtime. Well, it's not,
and that's a great point that you made, because you look at not just for sports but everything. When the '60s hit, you think about so many people. I know people probably previous generations remember when Kennedy was assassinated. Jack Kennedy or Dr. King or Bobby Kennedy, and that was like some of their first moments of remembering. Oh, when they heard that President Kennedy was shot in '63. They went to the TV, not the radio. They all went to television. All these moments, seeing the Vietnam War covered and Cronkite going over there.
The living room
was
war.
Television.
Yeah.
Right. TV. So I think football, like, mirroring the time, like everyone was kind of like, oh, okay, like the '60s, like when things are happening, society is going in such a upheaval. Where do we see it? Where do we get our information? Television.
Yeah, it's right there. That's such a good point. Now, other parts of the material would be the two leagues, AFL, NFL. I was just thinking about this the other day, and I think it still holds true for the most part. You can always tell the difference between an NFL team, like if you're unsure, like for instance, my wife, she got me a throwback style Bills sweatshirt for Christmas, and it looks like straight out of like 91, 92, that style. But I spotted a inaccuracy right away. I'm like, oh, you can tell it's a knockoff because it says NFC on it, and I'm like, no, but I'm like, I love it. Don't worry, I'll wear it. But they're an AFC team, because you can always spot the AFC/AFL teams because they have a much more like mid 20th century cartoony nature about them, whereas the NFL teams, it's like Eagles, Bears, Lions, where the AFL teams, they were like Dolphins and Bills and Patriots, just like
and the Chargers,
like those kind of Charger, Broncos. And a lot of them were serving cities who, a lot of Western cities got their teams for the first time, through the AF, or like smaller size markets like, Boston, great sports town. But even when you go back to, early 20th century, the Red Sox were, the Americans, the Boston Americans, they were like an upstart team. Like they were not, they were challenging, in 1903, the old guard of, baseball that had been around, because the National League had been around for about 30 years by that point. And, so football is the same kind of thing. It's like those teams, the NFL teams, the NFC teams, were a lot of them dating all the way back to the 20s and 30s, and their names and where they're from reflected that. So when we get to the first Super Bowl, it's the Green Bay Packers. It's such an ambiguous name, like packing what, like meat or cheese or just some kind of industrial job type thing. And then they're playing the Kansas City Chiefs, which sounds like, even with the logo, something straight out of like a Hanna-Barbera cartoon or something. It just
Right.
it didn't have quite the same depth to it. So it was almost like two versions of this, and that's exactly what it was. Two versions of the same game being pitted against each other. Now let's see which one is better.
Correct. And the thing is and kind of like it reminds me of how we talked about earlier with like why history and everything, but sports history, because you hear like, okay, the AFL, the NFL, and you think like, oh well, the NFL just won this which they call wink wink award, AFL NFL award, those 10 years 1960 to 1970, when the truth is the AFL, which they're the rebels, they beat the established NFL. And a lot of the innovations that the NFL took on that you still see today, they got from the AFL. And it really is a testament. Like, people don't realize or don't think about how it's an amazing story on how this upstart league, using television, but also using, more black players than what the NFL had, scouting at these HBCUs, which that was started, really with the AFL. The NFL, there was a quota on how many black players you could have on a team. With the AFL, that expanded. Also expanding, the passing game, showing that happening more and more as well. And also, just like you said, with the colors, and really, we talked about television with the AFL first with ABC and then NBC, using that big deals. And the NFL followed on, also using these television packages, but also the AFL was kind of making sure it was widespread and not just the big markets were getting, the big share. All these teams were getting equal share of that pie, and that was huge. And you mentioned the Chiefs, who were in the first Super Bowl, but you have to give a lot of credit to Lamar Hunt, who founded the AFL, but was also, longtime owner of the Kansas City Chiefs. And he had to think about, obviously he wanted his team to win, but he a lot of times came up with ideas to make sure the whole league won. And everyone, he knew, like, if he just wins or another team just keeps winning, but everyone else is failing, what league do you have? So what's better for not just my team, but for everyone?
Because there's been other attempts at football leagues since the NFL and the AFL merged together into one league, and the innovations that they try to come up with they just don't work well. And so, what's happening in the 60s, and thank you for the overview. I think it's a great insight into, once again, competition tends to benefit the audience so much. Like, people who are interested in watching football, who love football, can owe a lot of appreciation to those innovations that were taking place, because had they not, there's a good chance that the old style of football play, the run heavy, real grinded out style of football, that the NFC is still kind of known for, would persist a lot longer than had it not, had they not had that competition of, here's some new ideas, let's try these out. And so that way it's the ultimate, American, example of American, business competition that they were, introducing, like almost like the automobile industry, or,
Correct.
or soda, or, late night TV, like, offer up something new, and if the audience responds to it well, maybe everybody should adopt this attitude or this style or whatever you might have on your hands. So that's another, I think that the 1960s kind of, they get overshadowed to a certain extent by international news and, the turmoil that happened and was, like you said before, was on TV all the time. You couldn't, escape it really. But it was also, for the most part, especially here in the United States, it was a time of extreme prosperity. It was a good, economically speaking, for most of the decade, it was, Americans are doing pretty well. It was nothing too dramatic. Like, it wasn't like the 30s, when it comes to the Depression. Right. So there was plenty of people who had leisure time. They had money to spend. They had, ways to pursue their interests outside of their workplace or school. And so football, that's another reason why there's a competition to even happen, because they had a marketplace for their different ideas and their different ways of playing the same game, but doing it differently. But I think it almost solidified itself to become the ultimate American sport. Cause like baseball, that's huge in Japan. There are some differences between Japanese baseball and American baseball, but not so much so that like a Japanese ball player, and it's been proven several times now, can't come over to this league, or American ball players can't go over to that league and right. play each other. Whereas like by the 60s, by the 70s, I'm just kind of putting it out there, I would say like the CFL and the NFL had pretty distinct differences with their field size, their point structures, some of their rules. I remember trying to watch a Canadian football game one time, like, why are they punting on third down? What is going on? Right. Why did they get points for that punt? It's just kind of hard to follow. And it's like, because calling it the World Championship game, just kind of like the World Series in baseball, it's like, wait a minute, don't we need the rest of the world involved in this somehow before you can call it that? But they probably knew by that point, they're like, okay, this is the only version of American football that we can actually, it would be really weird if we had a Canadian team and an American team, like whose rules will we follow? So right. I think by that point, you have two leagues, but they're playing the exact same game on the same kind of field, same equipment, same size of team, same positions, just saw a little bit differently in how to carry it out.
Well, and I think that's a great point, Eric, because we were talking earlier about the 50s. A lot of times, like the previous decade, there's a hangover in the next one. Mm-hmm. The 50s, you had that expansion where you had people, the suburbs are growing, more homes, people, that whole 2-car garage, and having that, home, that their own like piece of land, their own home to have. Yeah. People were expanding, going out of the big cities. And that's also what the AFL helped to do with the NFL. The NFL had those certain franchises, but you look at the AFL coming on, you have a team in Colorado now. Mm-hmm. Denver, the Broncos have a team, another team in Texas, you have a team in Miami and Florida. So you look at it, what's a sport that, whether you're a city person, you're in the rural country, you're a suburb person, we all know football. Mm-hmm. A lot of times now it's sad, it's changed, but it used to be more like that for baseball. But now a lot of people in the city don't know baseball as well.
Right.
Or saw everyone may play hockey as much, but football is something. Hey, if I have someone from New York, I have someone from Green Bay, Wisconsin, I have someone from a little small town in Texas. We all know the NFL. We all can talk football. We all connect on that. Mm-hmm. And the AFL adding more franchises and to different cities, different states, help to spread this to not just a regional game, right, but now the whole country loves football.
And it seems to kind of take a cue a little bit from baseball in that way too, because for a very long time, I think until the 50s, the furthest western team was the St. Louis Cardinals, and they were also the furthest southern team too. That there wasn't, and yes. For football, for a long time, the Washington Redskins were the furthest south. Mm-hmm. They were they used to, even their fight song used to end with, instead of fight for old DC, they would say fight for old Dixie.
Old Dixie. Yeah.
And it was like, that was the South's team, even though, there's plenty of southern states, further beyond mm-hmm. that. And also, of course, further and further west. So, I think it's, again, we that's such a good way of putting it, as far as the reflection of the society at the time of, the 60s had so much more of that, people living similar lives, but in different corners of the country, and that national unity, that homogenization was still unfolding. It hadn't been completed yet. It was still, I hear you using all these football puns, but it was still incomplete pass that they were doing. So that I think kind of leads into, but also answers the question already of football status in society at the time of the first Super Bowl. It was, because I have very fond memories growing up, even if our team, and for a long time, my family's team was the Redskins, because my dad, he was in the Air Force, and so we moved around some, not as much as others, but he was in DC, stationed there in the mid 70s, right, with like the Sonny Jurgensen era, turning into the early Joe Theismann time period, John Riggins,
George Allen coaching.
Right, George Allen, the Hogs, and it was like they were the underdog team that everyone loved in DC, and RFK Stadium was always rocking. It was like, and so that was like kind of became our family. Even when the Redskins weren't in the Super Bowl, which in the 80s they were a lot, so it was nice. Yeah. But even when they weren't there, Super Bowl Sunday was such a big deal. Like, we would get our subs, we would get our soda, we'd get all of our chips and dip, and we'd start watching well before the game started, all the pregame stuff. Was that underway by 1967? Was that like, do you think it was, because I've always seen the Super Bowl as almost like a unofficial national holiday.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you think that was in the cards as early as 1967 with the first championship game?
I really, people may say that Pete Rozelle could see it. I don't know. The entertainment spectacle, I think that's a good one. I think the foundation was there. Do I think that they could see it for what it has become? Even by the time you get to like, the late 70s and then the 80s, and then, where it's just, like you said, it's the unofficial holiday and it's just a phenomenon. I think it'd be hard for anyone to see that. But I think the foundation, like you said before, that even though it's sport, it's competition, it's a dangerous sport, but it's still, at the end of the day, it's entertainment. And, this is the only Super Bowl that is simulcast because of the two contracts. Yeah. So the NFL with CBS, AFL with NBC. So the Super Bowl one is on, there's the NBC coverage, and then there's the CBS coverage. So I think that, and those networks, back then there's 3 networks.
Right.
So if it wasn't growing in popularity and big, I don't think both of them would have carried it, but they both had that deal. They both wanted to carry it. Mm-hmm. So I think that the foundation that this was going to be a special game and this was going to be their big event, it was there. I just can't imagine the phenomenon, I always go back to this, and sorry for being a little long-winded, but
no, not at all.
In the 90s, right, when Michael Jordan was, my grandparents would always have a big Memorial Day barbecue, mm-hmm. and a lot of like their family would come up for it, and it was in the 90s because that's the playoffs. It was like every year, old ladies who don't know anything about basketball, but they know Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan, he's always on TV every time I come here. And, that was a special time when everyone was watching the NBA. Everyone knew, like, everything stopped kind of, and not to the Super Bowl level, but everyone was watching Michael Jordan and the Bulls. The NBA has times like that where the NFL, every year, everything stops, and it amazes me the people who can't stand football, men, women, young, old, they don't like football, but they're at a Super Bowl party. You ask them, what are you doing Super Bowl Sunday? They're there somewhere because they're going to watch the halftime show, the commercials. They want to, so-and-so's a good cook. They have good food. It is, like you said, the unofficial holiday, and I just do think you're right, and the foundation was being laid for it to be an event. If he could, props to him. The way that everything just shuts down on Super Bowl Sundays, I just don't know if anyone could have saw that coming, though.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of the things that I cover on my program it comes down to one of two things: either somebody who spends a lot of time with a lot of attention to detail and makes sure that whatever they produce is exactly perfect in every single way, like a movie or a TV show, that attention to detail, and or they're visionaries of some sort, right? Like they have that. So I just recorded one the other day about Amazon and Jeff Bezos and how he and his partner that started. They weren't tech guys. They weren't internet guys. Like they didn't really know much about that. But what they wanted to do was fulfill this overall vision of making retail and e-commerce part of everybody's everyday life. And so it seems like the same kind of thing for professional football at the time was that, the perfect combination, that recipe of, TV is showing up in more and more homes. We have this tool. They probably if anything, this thing's going to stay pretty great, if not get better as the years go on. But I'm glad you hit on that perfectly. I mean, I guess this podcast, this dissection is going to keep going back to TV as sort of the nexus of why Super Bowls, starting with the first one, became what they are. Because, like you said, I mean, you can listen to football on the radio. It's not the same though. It's hard to, because you really need the big, larger than life stuff happening. You need the color schemes. You need all the even if basically I just need to know which direction they're going. To follow along. Whereas like baseball, you can figure that out on the radio pretty easily. And there's a lot of downtime where the announcers can talk about some story from 20 years ago about the guy that draws the third base line and how one day he forgot his chalk there, he had to, whatever, I'm making that up, but football, it's like fast paced, perfect for TV, and just like they go so well together. They're very well intertwined.
And it's interesting, Eric, because when thinking about it, like what's the primary, there's a lot of factors to why football grew, especially in this decade. But they all, you're right, are highlighted by the way they're presented on TV. How Lombardi and the Packers dominated the NFL in the 60s is a huge thing. And how the Packers became this model for how, team is done. Lombardi is like the ultimate coach, the ultimate leader. He has all those things where, Nixon and Kennedy, they're talking about Vince Lombardi and how he is. And he has a show on TV, the Vince Lombardi show, and Howard Cosell's talking to him. But you see everything, no matter what, he's won a lot of games. Paul Brown won a bunch of games before in the 50s and stuff. George Halas had won, but like I said earlier, with Lombardi having a movie, if you watch that old, you can see it on YouTube from the 60s. NFL Films did an hour documentary, which we're all used to now, but back then you didn't see that on football. But the way they're covering Lombardi and how he's leading everyone and how the players just have this precision. He had that patent kind of feel. And at a time, especially when the 60s, once JFK is assassinated and you have the civil rights and Vietnam and everything feels like it's going so crazy and everything's going apart at the seams in this country, people look for who are those heroes, who are those guys. Vince Lombardi was a big one. And he, the Packers are in Super Bowl I. He was carrying that mantra, the AFL's the rebel, NFL's the establishment. And so many people, Vince Lombardi felt the pressure. Wellington Mara, the owner of the New York Giants, wrote him a letter saying, you have to win this one. It's so important you beat the other team. Frank Gifford interviewed Lombardi before the game, and he said Lombardi was shaking. Lombardi had to hold on to Gifford's arm because he was so nervous, because they felt like everything rode on them keeping that NFL established and saying hey, we're the quote-unquote better league. So all those things being said is that Lombardi's a big factor in the Packers of the 60s in making this game bigger. But like you said, television, how he's presented, how they're presented makes it even greater. And it makes it come across like these are legends, these are heroes that everyone across America gets to watch every Sunday.
I love NFL films. It's one of my favorite. I didn't realize how long they've been around, that they've been doing that.
Yeah.
And I think that also must have been part of their overall winning package as to why
Absolutely.
professional football overcomes baseball as being the national attention getting sport. I don't know if we're ever going to call it pastime, NFL being the national pastime, just because that term pastime does not fit football pastime seems very leisurely, like you could
True.
Be sitting out and lounging out in right field, picking flowers and be like, oh, it's my pastime, whereas football, it's like you get crushed if you aren't paying attention.
Yeah,
so they don't really but like the focal point, football overwhelming baseball, overcoming baseball is the focal point. Really does rely on their presentation, how it's like packaged and exported. And that's another reason why, as here in the 21st century, football sells so well overseas. You go to a place like England, and they've even tried they send it to Mexico and a few other countries. Like, baseball can do okay in Japan because they already have it. Baseball in England, they're not interested. It's just it's too similar to cricket. They don't really, but it's not the same. Like, they already have that kind of sport. They don't need another one. They just don't, like, they have a baseball league in Britain, but it's like, nobody goes to their games at all. It's just like in the back of some park somewhere. Whereas like football, they love it. It's like, because they love the package, they love the presentation, they love the spectacle, they love how almost like tribal the fan bases are, with wearing the jerseys and painting their faces and everything. It's like, it seems to be, even though baseball is very, of course, American, football is even more. It's modern American. It's post World War II American. It's like,
Absolutely.
Here we are as this great futuristic industrial force, and so it's almost like the marriage of the two leagues a couple years after the first Super Bowl is what solidifies that. There, it's like, okay, now we have a sport. All these teams are combined. You have almost, if not one team per state, you have at least one team per region, so that everybody can get behind, and it turns into almost like another, opportunity for the country, like we were saying before, to unite over something. And I think it's such an important thing about that football can do more so than baseball.
One of my all-time favorite comedy routines is that of George Carlin comparing baseball and football. In it, Carlin identifies that baseball is a product of the pastoral 19th century, whereas football is 20th century, technological and modern. This difference could not be more evident in the era that produced the Super Bowl. While still very popular, baseball was losing favor to football because it didn't match the modernity of the culture the same way that its gridiron cousin did. Major League Baseball gave off an air that spectators in the stadium were just that, onlookers, and that the game would be played regardless if they were there or not. So much of football's rules and gameplay favors the fans, and not just the ones watching the game in person, but those at home watching the TV. But to go the extra yard, football itself was transforming because of the time period. The NFL, while newer than the other professional sports leagues, was 40 years old by the time the modern AFL began playing games. The two leagues played the exact same game with identical rule books, but the makeup of each league were the results of two different time periods and their respective societies. Needless to say, the first Super Bowl wasn't the only instance of this kind of clash in the 1960s. If you'd like to listen to the second half of this episode, please rush over to patreon.com/EPSpodcast or epspodcast.substack.com. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed listening to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, where everything, indeed, including Super Bowl I, is a primary source.